Hello, everyone, to the W Podcast After Hours snippet. We got some news after we just recorded the episode yesterday for Mythic Plus, and specifically Blizzard banning players in Mythic Plus who are consistently leaving and griefing keys. So that's a very interesting part of news. And I guess the first question to Saucy J here is what do you think about this, and what's your take?
Yeah, I think it's good. I had an issue the other day where I think we talked about it briefly yesterday, but where a person came in as a tank, we started the key, and then he instantly went DPS, and then we just lost the key. And I'm kind of in the mentality that you just run keys and you run them, and it's not a big deal. You just run them again. But I could see how some people have a limited time frame and are trying to get a certain level of keys. So I think this is a positive move. Um, there's not a lot of information about exactly how they're doing, but it seems as though they're really targeting perpetual abusers and not just people that feel like it's not going to get timed or what have you. So I think it's a good move in the right direction. I don't think it's um a permanent fix. I think it's just a step in the right direction. I mean, the key phrase there for me is repeatedly and recklessly, right? Those are pretty specific words, and I think that indicates they are looking at the data, right? Is this person leaving with 0 deaths? Is this person leaving when the key started right away? Like, what's the deal? So I think it's a step in a good direction, and hopefully we'll see more of this.
Yeah, I like that. And one sentiment, I guess, in the community so far is that there's no transparency of how exactly they're banning and what's the criteria. But then on the other hand, as someone who's done a share bit of managing things like this, if you have transparency and people know exactly how you're banning, people can actually exploit that because let's say there's a threshold where they say, well, if you leave the key 10 times and then on the 11th we're gonna ban you, right? Then
Yep.
people are going to leave. Like these people are gonna keep leaving, and then when they know that they're close to the edge, they'll stop then. So maybe not having transparency here is a positive thing. But I also welcome this a little bit. I have left keys myself sometimes. It's a rare occasion. But usually, there are people who, as you said, who leave intentionally. Even last season, I remember we had this Brackenhide Hollow run. We started, the timer was counting down from 10 to 0 for the key to start, right? The DPS paladin just turns around, leaves the dungeon, and leaves the group. And I was like, "What the hell, man? Like the key hasn't even started yet, and he griefed it." So yeah, I guess if it's about people like that, I'm totally fine, and we can only hope that there's gonna be no innocent people caught in the crossfire, basically, and getting banned just
Yeah.
because something, right?
Yeah. There'll be some complainers that say they were innocent, and you know what? Whatever. It is what it is. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I don't ever quit keys. I'll say, like, I'll kind of wait until there's some consensus among the group that it's just
yeah.
not gonna do it. I could tell if somebody just wants to finish for time, or for completion, I'll just stick in it. I mean,
Yeah.
even if I'm only gonna get 5 crests, it's like, it is what it is. I don't mind.
Yeah,
It
same.
happens.
There was a suggestion that maybe, how you join like a heroic run or something and heroic key, and there is an option to vote to kick somebody, right? And if everybody votes yes, then you kick the person because he's AFK. So maybe they can implement the same thing in Mythic Plus, but the question is going to be, is the key completed? And if everybody votes yes, then you're free to leave and there's going to be no penalty, right? But if people want to stick and not everybody votes, then you committed your intent to play on this key, so you have to finish it. So
Yeah.
maybe that's gonna be a good thing. But yeah, I mean, in general, it's probably a positive thing. And then another speculation is that maybe this is the first step into implementing a solo queue system into the Mythic
Mhm.
Plus dungeons and the LFG tool that they're using currently.
Yeah.
What is your take on that? And I guess my the first question is, what problems do you think a solo queue system in Mythic Plus is going to solve?
Well, I think it'll solve the queue times. I think, well, first of all, I'm like, I'd be super excited for something like this. I think that Um, you know, you have a way to incentivize tanks and healers when it's a solo queue because um, there's no kind of manipulation, right? Right now, you can't really incentivize tanks and healers because if there's a party of 5, they'll say, "Hey, we'll queue up as the party, and then you know you guys join, and then the healer and the tank can get incentives." But if it's solo queue, like in PvP, every time I queue up as a healer, I get extra bonus because there's not a lot of healers, right? And so there's an opportunity to incentivize players to get something extra if they're a tank or healer. And it's not always, well, it is always in PvP. It's just healing is really, you know, you got to have some thick skin to be healing PvP right now, and there's not a lot of us. But even in regular, I think heroic dungeon queues, oftentimes I'll get a notice that says, "Hey, if you queue right now as a healer or a tank, you can get this extra satchel that has like these runes and things in it." And so that's kind of cool. So they could do something similar for Mythic Plus. Um, so I think it solves, you know, the challenge for um, players who are not meta, hitting certain thresholds where they're not getting invites or they're only getting invites to like desperate keys as an example. So maybe Shadow Priest, for example, it's like way down there, right? Devastation Evoker, way down there. You know, those classes probably don't get often invited to middle tier keys where people are really trying to push to the next level. They are looking for people with high IO or high IO alts, decent gear, and meta classes, right? And so sometimes maybe those classes aren't getting invited. So I think it solves for those type of situation. Now you and I both know any of the 38 specs can complete all the way up to probably 12s, right? If you're a good player, you practice the class, you should be able to compete with any spec in the game right now. I don't think there's any spec that's just like, oh my god, this is unplayable. Um, but that doesn't account for the community and perceptions on what is the right thing to bring. So I think it solves that as well. And I'll kind of pause and let you kind of weave in some of your thoughts with that.
I'm not sure. Like, if you say you're gonna get 500 extra gold if you play healer, I don't know if that's going to solve it. Because the queue times is my main issue. It's my main problem, and it's across the board. Like, I usually play a healer, so we're not waiting for a healer. But right now, from my small window of playing the game, it seems like there's a huge shortage of tank because we spend enormous amounts of time in LFG2 just waiting for a tank. And it doesn't matter if it's like +5 on my odds, +10 on the geared
Mhm.
odds, or like +12 or 13 on my main. Although the higher the key becomes, I think it's harder to find tanks. That's my observation. So if that solves that, if a solo queue system helps to solve that, I'm all for it. I also play some DPS odds that it takes a while to get into keys just because they don't have like high IO, and not your main score is not always going to help with that. So for example, if it's easier for me to get into groups on my survival hunter, which I just play for fun, then I'll also welcome this. But as I said, I'm not convinced that this is going to solve it. I really hope so. And I can also see that it might cause some other problems as well because there's
Yeah.
going to be some, like, depending on how they implement it, but there's going to be some barrier entries, entries to barrier, sorry, barriers to entry, where the person who is managing the group is going to say, okay, I need you to be of certain class and I need you to have a certain skill, let's say a battle res, and I need you to have a certain IO, and then it's basically the same as the LFG2 right now. You're looking for that one specific person, and that's going to leave aside the survival hunters, the devastation evokers, and so forth. So it entirely depends on how they implement the system, but I can see it maybe solving some problems, but also maybe introducing some other problems. So I'm sitting a little bit on the edge of my chair here, and thinking whether or not it's going to be good.
Yeah, I think that they'll figure it out. And here's what I say: they're not going to implement it now. I think, you know, some of the conversations we had about the affixes will be fixed with solo queue. And I think the game is smart enough, or the developer is smart enough to say, hey, look, these four things need to be, or these six things need to be in a key. We need to have two low kicks. We need to have a battle res. We need to have a bloodlust, right?
Yeah.
And then you queue in, and there's no leader. You just queue as your role, and it pairs you with that group. And maybe some classes that don't have some of these things, I'm thinking like warrior doesn't have a dispel, it doesn't
Yeah.
have a battle res, it doesn't have bloodlust, it doesn't have a lot of stuff, right? Their queue times may be longer, but I would assume there's a spot for those kind of players or those kind of specs, maybe. That accommodate. And so I could see them designing a system that automatically pairs certain things together. And I think, when I look at, I mean, PvP's not exactly a good apples to apples comparison, but when you queue into BG Blitz, right, which is like random BG, you're always going to have two healers. You're always going to have, if it's, if tanks queue, there'll always be a tank on each team. And the rest are DPS, and they usually balance out range and melee. So it's not like one team is all casters and the other team is all melee. Like, it usually is a pretty balanced system. And obviously, same thing for solo shuffle. Well, not exactly the same. You're always going to have two healers and then the rest
Yeah.
DPS, or even sometimes just one tank, which is weird, but that happens. Um, and there's some interesting things that happen there too. And I'll be quick with this, but there's always like one or two just potatoes, right? For
Yeah.
lack of a better word, where they just don't perform, right? In solo shuffle, there's always one guy that goes 0-6. Unfortunately, and that's very frustrating as a healer, because it means you're only going to get 3 wins no matter how hard you play. I do my best to try to identify who that person is on match one and make sure that I try to get that person to win. I look at gear, I look at experience, I look at honor level, I look at all these things to try to determine who could possibly be the potato. And sometimes there's no potato and everybody's equally played, and it's good and it's fun, and then it's really skills. But sometimes there's just like the healer goes 0-6, and for me that's great because I get 6 wins and it's
Yeah.
easy. But when it's DPS, it's like you only get 3 and 3. When you correlate that to Mythic Plus, I think they're going to have to add another level of, hey, you know, whether or not this key gets completed, I'm going to look at a couple things. I'm going to look at overall damage. I'm going to look at overall utility that you're using. So usable utility, and are you using it? Kicks, for example, are you using your kick? Are you using your defensives? Are you using any externals? Are you using things? I don't know how they can. Yeah, they can measure and track that, but how does that correlate to your individual metric? So, for example, let's say you get halfway through a key and the tank's just like, "Hey, uh, I gotta go. There's an emergency.
Yeah.
Key's
It
depleted."
happens.
Does that mean everybody loses points?
Yeah. Well, maybe if you have that button, the key's completed, he can just ask them to push it. But yeah. All right. So one more question for you, because as we know, I don't have much PvP experience. So you have those queue systems in PvP that are implemented right now. Does that solve the waiting time when you want to play?
Not for. I mean, for me, it's amazing. I queue and I'm instant as a healer. On my DPS, it could be 10 minutes. It could be 20 minutes. It
Okay.
depends. And the higher up you go in MMR, as a DPS, it takes longer. As a healer, it's never really more than 3 minutes
Okay,
ever.
so I
It's
guess
really.
if that solves it, then maybe that's incentive to play as a tank and a healer. Maybe that's gonna be a positive thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they design it. I'm really excited for it, because I think they'll do one more thing. Before BG Blitz came out, they tested it in Dragonflight. They did like that fake thing, and people loved it, and now it's a permanent feature, right? So I think they're gonna do something similar first. Well, they'll test it out, get some numbers, work through the community, see what people are griping about, see what people like, and then hopefully come to something that makes a lot of sense.
All right, guys. Then fingers crossed they managed to do a good job out of it, because it's gonna be a very very nice thing if it works correctly.
Yep,
All right.
exciting.